I think we will get started. Thank you everyone for joining. The event this evening is being presented by the San Jose State Special Library Association Student Chapter, otherwise known as SLASC. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Tina Kremsner-Shing, and I am the Programming Director of SLASC. And I'm joined here today with April, who's also on the programming team with me, and I want to thank her and Rebecca and the greater SLASC teams for making this event possible. This fall, we have curated a series of events dedicated to engaging active members in the library and information science community who work on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. We hear the acronym a lot, but I wanted to discuss it in more concrete terms. So that is why we have invited Dr. Villagran today. We are honored to continue this series with Professor Villagran, a faculty at San Jose State High School whose research focuses on diversity and social justice issues in library and information science and cultural intelligence phenomena within libraries. Professor Villagran is based in the Los Angeles area and also serves as the CEO of CulturalCo, consulting in areas of diversity and inclusion, cultural competency and cultural intelligence, emotional intelligence, and conflict management. We're very excited to hear about all this today in depth. It will take the form of a semi-structured interview. I'll be asking questions and we'll be having a conversation. If you have any questions though, feel free to pop them in the chat and we will address them time permitting at the end. Feel free to leave your cameras on or off, whatever you're comfortable with, but please do mute yourself so that we don't get any side noises. And without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Villagran introduce herself.
What do you want me to say? You already did a great job, Tina.
Oh, okay.
I'll say thank you though. So I am not a current SLA member. I was for 22 years, but I went back to AALL, which is the Law Librarianship Association, which I have just remove myself from them for the next year. So I'm going to come back to SLA. I'm going to go in between because you know how associations can get expensive and very time consuming when you have lots of associations you become members of and join committees, and it becomes a lot of work.
Yeah.
But yes, so thank you to Tina for reaching out, and I appreciate the invitation.
Of course, no, thank you for joining us. I guess I will get started with what your educational background is.
So it's interesting because the MLIS was not my first degree, my first master's. So I got my undergrad at UNLV in Vegas, Emily, yay! And it was in international business and management. I did a dual major. And then I started my MBA at UNLV. I wasn't impressed with the program and at the time, so I ended up dropping out. And then I was working at the public library, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit. So I decided, why not get a master's in library science? And actually, I have a master's of science in legal informatics. It's in law librarianship from the University of North Texas. And they used to have cohorts. So they had a Nevada cohort where you would do, at the time, I think it was 8 days, 4 days and 4 days, like in the spring and fall at UNLV, and the rest was online. So it's a hybrid model. So I completed that while I was in Vegas, never went to North Texas. And then I ended up actually relocating to Houston. My first professional position once I transitioned out of public libraries was in Houston in law libraries, and I worked in a law firm. And I ended up going back and getting my MBA from North Texas. And then, life has strange ways of happening. So I ended up moving to LA, so back to the West Coast. And I went to Pepperdine for my doctorate. And my doctorate, I have an EDD, Doctorate of Education, and it's in organizational leadership. So not a PhD in library science. My world was very much corporate driven, also really special libraries, kind of in that corporate special library kind of space. And I thought I was going to go to law school, but ended up not doing that. So I ended up while I was at Pepperdine, I was getting the doctorate. I did a certificate in dispute resolution and then realized, well, you can get a master's like, I think it was like 5 more classes. So I took a year off for my doctorate to go get a master's in dispute resolution from the Strauss Institute at Pepperdine. And
Mm,
I will tell you, probably the most beneficial degree of all my degrees is my dispute resolution degree,
wow.
because you can use that like in everything, and
Yes.
everything from work to
Applicable.
personal. And so I have many degrees, but I think the important thing is how you apply them in your, professional and personal life and what you do.
Right. Right.
So that's kind of my educational short story.
Right. Yeah. What got you into legal informatics? Like if you first worked, if you is your first entree into the library information science world, like working in public libraries, or was it the master's in legal informatics?
So now public libraries, I've for Las Vegas, Clark County, the public
Okay.
library system for 10 years. I
Okay.
laugh now because if I was still there, I would have been retired and moving on to my next career.
Right.
So I still have friends that work there. Um, but no, my first job, I was 15 and a half, worked in a
Uh,
public library. It was the storefront that my mom would go grocery shopping and drop my sister and I off. So it was the storefront where I ended up working with some of the librarians that helped me when I was a young child.
That's nice.
Um, and
Opportunity.
then I moved up there. I worked circ. Wait, it was a page. Then I was circ assistant, reference assistant.
Mhm.
And then I blamed them because they had tuition reimbursement at the time. I don't know if they still
Mm.
do. So they paid for my library degree. I just had to,
Wow.
you had to commit like so many years per. And then I left. So I actually had to pay them back because
Oh,
I didn't
wow.
stay. But
Oh,
I
no.
blame them. They made me into a librarian.
It's
And
nice
the
to have
reason
that
I
program.
didn't, yeah, and the reason I didn't go away become a lawyer is because, and that's what I really wanted to do. But the
Mm.
reason I didn't was twofold. Um, you have to take a little test called the LSAT. The first time I took it, I did great, really well, but I don't know, you're young, whatever. And it was only good, I think, for 5 years. And so I had to retake it. I retook it and I had pneumonia when I retook it and I like bombed. So I said, forget it. Law school is a no.
Oh,
And this
no.
the second reason, I was already working in public libraries and I really loved helping public patrons that had legal questions.
Mm,
Um, and all we had at our location, we had like the Nevada Revised Statutes, we had a lot of the self help NOLO books. We didn't have a lot of legal, and so I have to refer them to the Clark County, the law library, or even UNLV didn't have a law school then, so there weren't a
okay.
lot of places to send patrons. And
Right.
my employment professor, I had took employment law in undergrad as kind of an elective,
Okay.
and he told me, so there's such a thing as a law librarian. You don't have to throw away your
Right.
expertise and what you learned from public librarianship. Just
Right.
transition those skills into law libraries. So it was
Mm,
a win. So that's kind of how
right.
I transitioned and why.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I
It
didn't
was
know about
fun.
all of it. Yeah.
I had
Okay.
no idea. I don't know how many
Yeah.
people knew about law library or even like medical
Right.
librarianship.
Okay. Yeah. Were you working as a law librarian? Um,
Not
okay.
not so in Vegas, I did. I left
Okay.
the public library. I had to go back to the public library though, because the law librarianship paid less at the time. I
Oh,
worked at the only law firm in the state of Nevada,
wow.
which is no longer there.
Okay.
Um, but I was a law library assistant full time, and then I ended up working part time as like a floater back at
Mm,
LVCCLD, and
okay.
then I moved to Houston.
Okay. Okay. And then how did you make your foray into teaching and then establishing Cultural Co?
So when you say never
Right.
or never say no.
Right.
I remember I moved to LA. I actually was working for a legal vendor. I used to work for, after I left law firms, I worked for West, which is a Thomson Reuters business. So if you know Westlaw, some of the databases.
Mhm.
I loved working for them. I was doing library relations. I had like a territory. I traveled a lot. I
Oh,
visited with law
wow.
librarians, but they laid me off.
Uh,
And so when that happened, I was like, oh, what am I going to do? and think I just started my doctorate. I started in 2008,
Okay.
and I came across an article on cultural competence,
Mm-hmm.
and I became a little obsessed. I ended up getting certified and then advanced certification, and then
Oh,
I got an implicit bias certification. And this was
um,
before all of these terms we now we
right.
read the
Yeah.
paper, we see it on the news, it's right there.
Right.
This was really before the whole, I would say, EDI movement became
Right.
so upfront.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was really intrigued, and I said, well, I always had the corporate or the business mindset. And I worked for a huge, I think TR at the time, and it wasn't Thomson Reuters, it was Thomson West until they merged or got acquired and became Thomson Reuters. But there were like 40,000 people. That was, the organization was huge, and the legal division was about 10,000 or 12,000. It was the largest division in the organization.
Okay.
So I really liked like the corporate side and the business side.
Yeah.
Um, and so that made me think, why can't I do that?
Right.
It's very daunting. Starting a small business is very
Yeah.
daunting.
Yeah.
I think I did my website. I did like all these little pieces, but it wasn't official. I only made it
Mm-hmm.
official like three years later. I formed an
Um,
LLC.
uh-huh.
Um, but it's because I got laid off. And my
Right.
first
Okay.
big client
Uh-huh.
was a vendor. It
Oh,
was
wow.
a legal provider, and I
Uh-huh.
actually was doing competitive intelligence work for
Oh,
them for a
okay.
year.
Okay.
And the president at the time was so supportive and very like, you can do it. Like, this is
Yeah.
freelance. You could just start freelance
Yeah.
and then build it into a
That's
real business.
awesome. Yeah. To get that encouragement from
And
like,
then now there's like unlimited work everywhere I turn. I have to say no.
oh gosh.
Um, but academia is a different story. It's the never
Okay.
say never.
Yeah.
Where I was here in LA, and my best friend is she's a professor at Cal State Northridge,
Uh-huh.
and we were on the beach. I'll never forget, because we were talking about academia, and I think she became interim director for her department at the time, and
Okay.
she's full professor. And I said, I will never go into academia. The whole tenure track is just
Right.
scary, and that's like beyond starting a business. Like, I'll die.
Yeah, it's
And she's like,
daunting.
okay. And then like 2 years later, I think I got hired at North Texas to be a lecturer.
Oh, okay.
Even though I lived in LA, I actually worked for UNT for 3 years.
Oh,
And
okay.
I would go to Texas every month, like I
Wow.
lived there. And
Yeah.
then so I taught 6 classes.
Wow. That's a
Um,
heavy load.
yeah, I was only teaching. I wasn't doing research or any
Okay.
service work.
Okay.
And that was my into academia.
I see.
And
Yeah.
then San Jose kind of came to me. So it's like,
Right.
ooh.
Okay. Okay. And were you teaching cultural competence at that time the way you do at San Jose State right now, or?
No, and actually at that time, because this was 2015 to 2018, I don't think any ALA accredited program had an equivalent course. And even now,
Oh,
and I wrote
okay.
an article about this with
Uh-huh.
Dr. Wamda, even now I think there's like 4 schools that have a specific cultural
Really?
competence course.
Wow. Okay. And then how did you develop your course?
I just asked, and then
Okay.
I said I want to do it. And
Uh-huh.
actually, Dr. Main said, because I had some other proposed ideas,
I see. Okay.
but this one, because it is truly my expertise, being
Right.
certified in it and having
Yeah.
done consulting.
Yeah.
Um, it kind of was a nice pairing. But now I
Right.
want to add to it, and I know I have a few students like Catherine heard this earlier. I want to add the cultural humility more present in the
Yes.
course.
Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah. I was
Because
reading
right now
about,
it's very cultural competence and cultural intelligence heavy.
right. Yeah. No, I was reading about the cultural humility aspect and how I'm like, that makes a lot of sense to make it more about humility, not like a checkbox of like, you have gotten confident now.
It's
Yeah.
just like a DEI training. You go to a training, okay, now
Right.
it's
Yeah.
a
There's
lot of government organizations, unfortunately, like that. It's a checkbox. It's just a
right.
requirement, but
Yeah.
that doesn't, no, that's not how
Right.
it works.
Yeah. Yeah. Where I guess this is slightly off of the Q&A, but I was wondering where you stand on the discussion of like multiculturalism and diversity being terms that are not very precise and a bit superficial for actually uncovering more like the institutional problems that make these courses necessary in the first place? Where
It's interesting you mentioned that because I was talking to someone this afternoon about how almost every single term we come across now has been either like destroyed
Right,
or politicized, or
right,
like the meaning has been changed, and it does depend on the context and
right,
how it's being used. But like the term diversity alone has, like, even the term culture, like,
right,
we're losing the original meanings, I think, and
right,
then lumping them all together is kind of like, well, here's what they all mean, or they're interchangeable, and they're not.
right, right,
um, and yeah, we're not getting to the core of looking at um, like historical context,
right,
institutional aspects, and all of the isms we need to be addressing.
yeah,
Um, it's a lot of work.
yeah,
A lot of work.
yeah, yeah,
One of you can take that on.
yeah. The next generation. Yeah. I mean, then at this point, how would you articulate what it means to be culturally competent?
Okay, so this am I now I'm because I like to use some of the definitions that have been around and
Uh-huh.
are kind of the foundation.
Mhm.
However, there's some concerns, and I apologize for those that have taken my class and have heard some of this similar from me in other presentations. Um, so originally, I mean, you can think of just cultural competence like loosely defined as the ability to engage with people across cultures,
Mhm.
just in general. It's how you engage. Now, then we have to break that all down. And it came out of really um, back in the 60s and 70s, really the civil rights movement, if we go all the way back and look at the history. But then healthcare is where really the term is rooted, I would say, and in social work. Healthcare because they tie it to like evidence-based practice, and also, if you can or are more knowledgeable about a certain culture that you are providing healthcare to, then there's greater competence in practice.
Mhm.
Um, Cross in I think it was 89 has one of the most like known definitions. So I'm going to read the exact definition so I
Okay.
don't get definition incorrect here. A set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals and enable the system, agency, or professionals to work effectively in cross cultural situations.
Mhm.
So, at the root, I think if we have to break it down, at the root of this is the idea that cultural competence is a practice, and you aren't, like we said, right? It's not a checkbox, you become culturally competent, but it's a journey. I always say in the class, it's a journey and
Yeah.
it's ongoing. So that means everything from not just valuing, I should say, diversity and appreciating difference, but also doing your own self-assessment. And this is where the cultural humility comes in, because that's really
Right.
the reflection, the almost what you have to do before you even get to thinking about if you're working on cultural competence.
Right.
But then also there's the institutional cultural knowledge, if we're looking at an organization, so your library or where you might work. And then there's all the different communities that we serve. So there's
Right.
all these elements that kind of make it up. And
Mhm.
I will tell you that there is a problem with cultural competence. I
Yeah.
agree with this, and many scholars have talked about this in the literature. Two issues. One, if you look at like this model and even models before in the past, it's where there's an end. Like you are culturally competent, which is not true. Like this is ongoing work. It's not a check. I'm now culturally competent.
Right.
So that's one. It's really there's a shift now. I think if you look at newer models and newer
Mhm.
definitions, are either cyclical or ongoing
Right.
because um, because of this. And I'll get to the whole cultural humility, sensitivity kind of piece. But before I get to that, the other problem I think with cultural competence, which I know a few scholars have talked about, is that it suggests that there is a categorical knowledge a person could attain from a group of people. So, because I study and am aware of a specific group and their culture, then I'm attaining like this knowledge, and then I'm putting them in a category or a box, which
Right.
then leads to bias and stereotyping. So that's the other, I think, main concern with cultural competence.
Mhm.
But, and I know I'm talking a lot, but I'm trying to explain it kind of in a holistic way for those that haven't really thought these terms through. Um, Cultural humility actually is newer, was introduced, I think, in 98, and is really that lifelong process, the self reflection, the personal critique. It starts with us, right? Acknowledging our biases and then recognizing there's a shift because now we're not tackling, we'll say, a specific group. We're really starting with ourselves and understanding our own identities, even the intersections,
Mhm.
all of the aspects of your own culture. And I think cultural humility is a great like addition to cultural competence. I don't think you can take separate them. I think they need to be together, and work well together because it involves understanding the complexities that then lead to how can you become and work on becoming, and can
Right,
you ever really truly be culturally competent?
right,
Probably not, because it's an ongoing process
right,
and depends on the context. But it's complex. You can look at some of the models and the continuums, um, but we have to think about, I think, our feelings, our own thoughts, and how they manifest depending upon the situation and as we're going through different stages, even in our lives and where we're at in our careers.
right. Yeah.
Okay, any questions on that? Tina, did that make sense?
Yes, yeah, I was, for one of our I think the diversity, one of the classes, um oh, services for ethnically and racially diverse communities, that class. I chose this topic because I was really interested in more like the linguistic side of like what kind of terms can you use to encapsulate this really complicated direction that I feel like library information science as well as other industries are trying to focus on, which is now no under the umbrella of like DEI, even though there's a lot more complicated ways of like manifesting what DA wants to say. But it has been kind of, I don't want to say corrupted, but like used in a
Yeah,
cultural sense. Yeah.
even look at library. I have my students do this. Look at library association standards or guidelines or
Yeah.
their own competencies and look at the terms that are used. And many
Yeah.
of them are going through iterations and revisions,
Yeah.
but then seeing where maybe they use a term, but it's not, is that a diversity term? Is it really
Right.
what they're saying? And then maybe cultural competence needs to be built in there,
Right.
humility,
Right.
humbleness.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's really, yeah. When I saw the cultural humility, I'm like, okay, it's nice to see that there's some criticism of the checkbox kind of mindset, or like, which can obviously like lead to like tokenism and like so many other issues that we like other institutions are being criticized for. Um, yeah, no, but thank you for that overview. You like address multiple questions in one.
that's
Um,
like my whole course in a nutshell, kind of, kind of.
no, thank you for sharing. Are there any trends that you've noticed in the way that your clients at Cultural Co approach or conceive of cultural competence? Like, are they aware of the sensibilities of like cultural competence versus cultural humility, or is that something that you really try to emphasize now and bring in from the literature?
It's an interesting question. When I saw that on the list, I was like, that's
Yeah.
interesting because I think it depends on the client.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, I worked with a really great public library system in Oregon for a whole year and went through a whole similar to my course, but expanded for all of their staff, for their board, and their volunteers.
Mhm.
And I think it was so eye-opening to many that participated because they hadn't thought of kind of the terms in the way and based on, the location, and what they were like experiencing in their own neighborhoods.
Right.
Um, but then, and it's funny because recently I would say I'm not getting as many requests related to the cultural competence.
Right.
It's more conflict related due to cultural issues,
Right.
which cultural competence could be built in there. Or I'm
Right.
getting a lot of, anti-racism requests, and I don't do a lot specific with, there's other wonderful organizations and consultants that do that type of
Right.
work. But I would say I worked for the law enforcement agency several
Um,
years ago, actually, and they were probably the most challenging organization to work with because of the type of clientele. I
Right.
was the only female,
Oh,
and I
wow.
think other than there was an interim chief and she was female,
Okay.
I was there were only, I think, 2 people of color in the room.
Wow. Yeah.
It was very difficult. I'll never forget because we're in a U shape in one of the
Mhm.
sessions, and one of the sergeants turned around, crossed his arms, and faced the wall, did not want to participate.
Wow.
And the chief, she went and took him out and talked with him, and then he came in and she put him in the middle,
Wow.
facing not me, facing everyone else.
Yeah.
His back was to me, but I went out and I was on the other side, and so
Yeah.
he was then in the middle. I don't think that was the best strategy, but in the end, I think it was a really interesting, and that was not about cultural competence. That was actually
Okay.
about bias, which
Okay.
this is long before everything that's happened with
Right.
our communities and law enforcement.
Mhm.
But it was really eye opening to see how there was that lack of receptive, like,
Yeah.
and really I could pin that on a lack of cultural competence, like not wanting
Right.
to understand and appreciate their communities that they said. And I'm like,
Right.
so
Yeah.
like your neighborhoods that you're protecting, and yeah,
Right.
it was
Yeah.
very
Like a
opening. So I
disconnect
think
of
it
it.
depends.
Mhm.
I don't bring in heavy, like, literature and
Okay.
scholarly.
Right.
Libraries care, but if it's
Right.
a it depends on the client and what they
Yeah.
want.
You have to
Um,
cater to your
yeah, and I
audience.
have to balance it because I say often no to a lot of prospects because
Um,
of my priority is San Jose, so I can't
okay.
do as much as I wish I could.
I see. Okay. Okay. Yeah. What would you recommend to a library student who wants to try their hand at going into consulting, like information
Yeah,
science or even cultural competency?
it could be in any, there's so many, like, grant writing. I mean, there's so many,
Uh-huh.
like, areas you could do it freelance and then
Right.
slowly just build up, maybe create a website, have some business cards.
Uh-huh.
All of the I won't say all, majority, I should say, of the clients I've worked with have been through word of mouth. These
Oh,
are
wow.
not,
Okay.
and through going to conferences and making connections.
I see.
So
Right.
I think for students that are interested, and if you have an area you really want to be seen of having that kind of, I don't just say necessarily expertise. I mean, that is very important, or if you get credentials or certifications, but also kind of build your own little niche area. So, what is your like sweet spot? And
Right.
that's what I did. Mine was really cultural competence, the conflict side.
Mhm.
Libraries are a bonus because I was a librarian, and that's kind of
Right.
just the field that
I
just adds
see.
on.
Yeah.
Um, but if you can kind of, and many of us have talents outside of librarianship or information science. So
Right.
figuring out how you can build that into kind of like a side. A lot of things start like part time and as side gigs and then turn
Mhm.
into full
Yeah.
time. Creating your
Right.
own or go into partnership with someone that you trust and develop
Right.
your own organization together. We
Right.
we need I think more, not just in cultural competence, but a lot of different areas.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. How did you bring in the cultural confidence within legal librarianship? Like, I'm
Yeah, that
curious about that combination and like your research and your dissertation on that front.
I was again obsessed with cultural competence, and I
Uh-huh.
was also like, I want to still be in the legal field. And
Yeah.
I was doing at the time I worked for Thompson when I was working on my doctorate, and actually my at Pepperdine, the way it works, before you do your dissertation, you have to go through your comps, your comprehensive exams.
Okay.
And it's basically, I don't know if they still do it this way, but it's basically you write a big old paper,
Uh-huh.
huge paper where you incorporate something from every one of your classes. So
Oh,
a
okay.
change management model,
Okay.
a organizational behavior theory, and you
Mhm.
have to apply it to a specific project. So I utilized at the time, Thompson was going through kind of the reorganization.
Okay.
And so I did like a real life application of, well, here's the change model they should use and why and what it would look like, kind
Uh-huh.
of a redesign and reorg of our unit within the larger
Oh,
legal
cool.
division.
Yeah.
Of course, they didn't. mine did. Yeah, it didn't happen. But so that's how I kind of utilized where I was working and do, with law librarians and working in that space, but as part of my educational understanding of all of these concepts.
Mhm.
And then when I got to dissertation time, finished all my coursework, I was like, I don't know what I want to write about. I want to do
Mhm.
something with kind of this cultural competence, cultural intelligence.
Yes.
I still love law libraries and I'm still at, working with law libraries. So that's where kind of the two came together because I
Mhm.
realized that no one was writing about cultural intelligence specifically, which is different than cultural competence.
Right.
And I can define that in a minute.
Mhm.
But there was no one writing about that and law librarianship. There's
Mm.
stuff about
Yeah.
lawyers and
Right.
attorneys, right? But there was no, and there was very little too, honestly, and there still is in library and information science.
Mhm.
Overall has a great model and is one of the ones that probably is referred to the most when thinking about services and
Uh-huh.
programming and the communities you serve. But there's slowly been some literature tying kind of the cultural competence, even cultural humility, and the cultural intelligence has probably been mostly me, only because
Mhm.
I think there's a need. Um,
Right.
and that has its own model, so it's a differing model, but
Okay.
could overlap. Um,
Uh-huh.
it deals with motivation, knowledge, strategy, and action.
Okay. Okay.
Um, and I do want to mention because I know, like, we're going to talk about issues. Do you want me to mention a couple
Oh,
issues
yeah,
that
yeah,
I
that would
see?
be great to have, like, a few examples of, like, specific issues related to cultural intelligence in law libraries that you studied or noticed.
Well, there's one big one, and I don't know. I know there's some of you academic focused on academic libraries here, so I'm going to use that because this is a recent one. It's really an important one,
Mhm.
especially in academic law libraries. So, and I think you all agree this is important to integrate these concepts, no matter what segment or industry, or you could be in engineering, wherever you're at. I think it's necessary, right, to have the integration and out of the practice side, executing them
Mhm.
so that we can remove inequities and inequalities in our workplaces. But
Right.
lawyers, I mean, they have an obligation if you look at kind of their own requirements. So they're supposed to act, integrity, ethics, all of that.
Right.
Law professors and even law librarians are often professors of law, and so they also teach. So they're professors as well as librarians. They also have an obligation to prepare students, similar to like we do at SJSU,
Mhm.
so that they're ethical, being responsible participants in the legal profession, etc.
Mhm.
So in the law librarianship, I guess academy, we'll call it.
Mhm.
Um, there have been or just legal education. There's been a lot of recent movement where they're now taking actual steps to solidify diversity, equity, and inclusion in the legal profession
Okay.
for um, legal education for, you know, to become an attorney or even law librarianship.
Uh-huh.
The ABA, so the American Bar Association, they recognize this, that there was this like importance to expand
Right.
further in legal so in I think it was 2021, I want to say May or June,
Okay.
they actually came out with a memorandum which outlined proposed standards for law schools
Uh-huh.
um, that included, it did not limit, but it included training on bias, cross-cultural
Okay.
competence,
Mhm.
and racism for students, faculty, and staff.
Okay.
So this came down from the Bar Association, and from what I understand, it was, I think, adopted. I'm trying to look at my notes here, but I don't have all the dates. February 2022. So this is very recent. This
Yeah.
shows like we're behind the time. We're like slowly catching up. February 2022. They recognize that academic integrity requires law schools to prepare future lawyers
Mhm.
for a worldview when it comes to thinking about racism and bias.
Yeah.
So they created a standard. It's actually in the new or revised, I should say. I think it's 12. they have 12 new, not 12. I can't remember, maybe it's number 12, but somewhere 12 is
Mhm.
in there. But they
Yeah.
have this new standard, and I'm going to quote it because I have the direct quote.
Oh,
So I don't know exactly. Standard 303C. So
uh-huh.
this you can go Google ABA standard 303C.
Okay.
States that, quote, a law school shall provide education to law students on bias, cross-cultural competency, and racism. And it's at 2 times. So this is the thing I don't understand. I don't know why they had to add this, but one at the start of the program of their legal education,
Okay.
and then two at least once again before graduation.
Okay.
I think they could have left those out and it should just be integrated throughout
Right.
your legal
Yeah.
education.
A bit more
Um,
holistically.
so many I and like similar to Clara, I know I was at her talk before and I know her.
Right.
I actually don't have a law degree.
Uh-huh.
Um, but many librarians, of course, if you're in academic law libraries and you want to move up, you
Yeah.
may need to have a JD. So this is why it's so critical in academia for
Right.
academic law librarians, because not just law and remember staff, faculty, students, and if you're teaching and you're a law librarian that has professorship and
Yeah.
is teaching, then you also have to have this training and train your
Right.
students.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one big, and that's very recent. February
Okay.
20, that was like
Yeah. 8 months ago.
5 months ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, law firms are a little slower, and because they're
Okay.
corporate or private,
Yeah.
it's very different. Though I know of many law firms that now do have, um, regardless what they call them, but they
Yeah.
might have, DEIA, ideal committees, task forces.
Yes.
I know some that have been very active. I know like Reed Smith.
Mhm.
I don't know where my friend Andre's at. I forgot, but his firm's very active or was very
Uh-huh.
active. So a lot of them have been doing more like programming and initiatives.
Yeah.
Um, I do know in law librarianship, they're still struggling kind of with the same thing. I think as a whole, librarianship is with bringing in BIPOC, people of color,
Yeah.
indigenous. There's still that struggle.
Yeah.
So encourage your friends. It's a great area to be in. Um, so I think, I mean, that's one big example.
Okay.
And then like
Yeah.
state county court, it's really dependent on funding and
Right.
if there's compliance.
Uh-huh.
I know state of California, this was only law enforcement though. I'm surprised it didn't trickle down to courts.
Okay.
Um, I know that law enforcement were required to get implicit bias training, and there was
Oh, wow.
something in there regarding. I don't think they called it cultural competence, but
Okay.
could read between the lines, and that's what
Right.
they were saying.
Interesting.
Um, but I
Okay.
don't think it trickled down to like state, county court,
Okay.
specifically law librarians.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
and that would probably depend on the jurisdiction and
Right.
even funding, and then what that might look like.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you.
I hope that example helps, especially those looking at
Yeah.
academia.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that definitely helps. Thank you. I want to leave some time for the questions. I just have um one question that I want to close with was what kind of cultural intelligence topics have been on your mind recently, or is particularly issues or organizations, projects that stood out to you when you were reading through the literature?
Well, I'm like on a cultural humility kick right now.
Okay.
I had
Yeah.
a wonderful speaker earlier today, and
Uh-huh.
um, Zan Goodman over at UNLV is a good friend of mine, and I
Mhm.
know she did, I think it was the Info People or another training, and she even I think did a webinar for us for our diversity committee, which has now been renamed, by the way. We're
Okay.
what do we rename ourselves? Uh, IDEA,
Um,
inclusive diversity, equity, and accessibility, because we often forget about the importance of neurodivergent
right.
accessibility, all of that.
Yes.
Um, and that actually is another area too, with neurodivergent. That's, I think, a huge
Yeah.
area that we need to be focusing on. I've realized and I've noticed there are more students, faculty, and staff that
Yeah.
identify in that with that category, and resources are not necessarily there. Um, we can do a way better job. I think that's an area there's
Yeah.
a gap even in the research. There's a lot
I
that needs
see.
to be done with libraries and kind of the neuro divergent space, autism,
Yeah.
all of those like cognitive aspects. And
Yeah.
it'll help us be better educators. It'll help us
Right.
really to serve our students better.
Right. Yeah.
And then you asked, oh, organizations or where students should look.
Yeah.
So
Come to mind.
I always say go outside of library associations. Of
Mm.
course, be involved with them and look at what
Okay.
they're doing and what,
Yeah.
if there's a committee you can join or a task force. And, it could be just one small project you're a part of.
Uh-huh.
So do that, yes, but also look outside, because I'm actually a member probably of more, it's changed a little bit, more non-LIS organizations
Oh, okay.
than I
Yeah.
am LIS,
Okay.
only because it just makes me more kind of well-rounded and I can bring that
Yeah,
into the classroom.
definitely.
So
Yeah.
cultural competence, there's an organization I actually just joined this year. I'm going
Okay.
to their conference in a couple weeks.
Okay.
I can put it in the chat. It's called
Okay.
CTAR. It
Okay.
is an intercultural competence organization.
Oh, cool.
And actually they have a Europe one. There's all
Oh, wow.
different kind of, I don't want to say branches, but this is
Okay.
a link to the USA one.
Oh,
And there are other ones, but this is one my friend in Israel, she's a
uh-huh.
consultant out there, and she told me about, she said, why don't you come to Europe and come to and I was like, I'd never heard of this organization,
Yeah,
CTAR.
that's
And
cool.
it's educators, researchers, practitioners, students, really anyone interested in intercultural or cultural competence. And
Great.
then another one is in Arizona. I'm on their listserv. I went to their conference some time ago.
Uh-huh.
Um, I have to look up the name and send it
Okay.
to you.
Okay.
But it's another, and it's always in kind of Phoenix, or Tucson.
Okay.
Um, but those are specific to kind of if you want to learn about all the
Yeah.
differing cultural competence, cultural humility, cultural
Right.
intelligence, cultural,
Okay.
intercultural, all those terms.
Right. Great. Thank you for sharing.
You're
Um,
welcome.
I am going to share some of the questions I saw in the chat.
Okay.
Emily asks, where do you stand on the idea of or ideal of library neutrality? Are libraries neutral? Should they aim to be? Very
Ooh,
on
that's a
topic.
yes, and
Hot topic.
that's a big, I think a heavy question to like a big question.
Yes.
I think they should be, but that's hard. I think because again, so looking at, well, what does neutrality really mean? Again, there's a term that has, I think, been convoluted and then politicized. And so it probably will depend on your jurisdiction or your region where you're at. If you're in a smaller, and if we're talking specifically public libraries, um, I think, I mean, when government's involved, it gets a little different,
Mhm.
takes longer. So uh, I feel that they should be, but it often doesn't happen that way. And also, I think it depends too on the people that make up the organization,
Right.
because there's a balance and we have to each understand what does that mean for us, and then in what services we provide and how we provide those services. That's a really great, I think we need to find a speaker for you for that,
Yeah.
specific to special libraries,
Yeah.
because I'm thinking in like, doesn't really work like law firm. I
Yeah.
mean, there's like, but it doesn't work, I don't think, in that context. I always think
Yeah.
of public libraries when I think
Yeah.
of
Neutrality.
neutrality. So
Yeah. I think of in the context of like archives. At least I've
yeah,
seen both literature about archival neutrality and like some of the different phases of theories behind how to be an archivist.
and I
Um,
think it's an opportunity, and we probably should be aiming for that. But I feel like there needs to be frameworks and more. There was a great training recently. Neutrality was discussed. It wasn't the main topic, but they talked about things like copyright,
mm,
intellectual freedom. It was
right.
a really great, and I think it was recorded. If I find it, I can send it to you and you can
Okay.
share it, Tina.
Great. Thank
But again,
you.
it was public library focused.
I
So I
see.
don't know, Emily, if that's kind of where you were thinking. Other questions?
Yes. Feel free to unmute yourself as well or type them out.
Oh, and I see, yes, I made a comment about working in, oh, I'm so glad you work in restorative justice.
Yeah.
Um, but yes, police departments, law enforcement I used to teach conflict management to law enforcement professionals in person, and probably the hardest courses I've ever taught. But
Yeah.
also probably the most rewarding because once you see, and then if you follow that, and I've been following my students and see where and then you hear about the impacts they've made.
Yeah.
Um, and it's challenging, I think, for all of us.
Yeah. Must be rewarding afterwards.
I see a great question. How did you work and do graduate work at the same time? Any tips? I did not sleep. Do not follow my advice in this. Don't do what I did. It's part of my best advice you should follow. Um, I was working full time. Actually, I always either had two jobs or was working full time,
Oh, wow.
and went to school full time.
Wow.
Not yeah, and I mean, and I had a life though, and but I did not sleep a lot. I always would get my 4 to 5 hours and still
Oh, no.
function fine. Now I'm still like that, but I have to now I take naps because of COVID.
Right.
Um, but I don't recommend that. I think the best strategy is, especially if you're working full time, because clearly you want to keep your job.
Right.
So it's okay to go to school part time, and whatever works with your particular situation. I think knowing your own, and this is where self assessment's great, because if you know your own like discipline and styles and everything, um, just map that out one day. And like, oh, like the best time that I'm like on point and my best hours to work are from, I don't know, I'm making this up, but 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. at night. So that might be your peak time to work on the papers you have to write for assignments.
Mhm.
Um, or you have family obligations. So kind of working around that structurally.
Right.
Um, I don't know. You just do it because you have to do it, I guess. That's really the worst
Sometimes in the
answer to give.
moment, yeah.
Yeah.
Only
Like,
afterwards you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I had to do it like that.
have buddies. I always
Yeah.
call them buddies. Have like those that keep you accountable, not just whether it's your spouses, parents, family, friends, but people you work with or within like SLA, have those buddies you can call. Not, I wouldn't say just as mentors, informal, formal, but buddies. So I have at San Jose a colleague of mine, Dr. Daryl Hoffman, who's over the Mara program. We keep each other and we laugh. We're like, we both suck. We are like, but it's like we know we hold each other accountable and we get things done, and it's always so good. But we know each other's style and we call each other out, but at the same time, we support each other. Like when I had COVID, she helped me with some things we had to do that I couldn't do, and then even like with what's going on tomorrow, Tina, as you know, like, but we work together. So if you
Yeah.
have those people that you can trust and
Yeah.
they can help you, I think having kind of that support
Yeah.
is important. I
Yeah.
don't know if any of those tips helped you, but
No, it's still nice to know
yeah,
what would help
whatever
you.
works for you. I
Yes.
think it's all, yeah, independent.
Yeah.
Um,
Knowing it
oh,
as
and
a
it looks like
possibility. Yeah.
Dr. Hoffman is, yeah, interviewing her for, that's great. Yep. Um,
Awesome.
they are first generation,
Oh, cool.
and that's great.
Thank you for sharing, Erin. Great.
Other
Are there
questions?
any other questions?
And Tina, let me ask, I know you had more, I think, on the list. I don't know if we got
Yeah.
to them. I
Oh,
closed it.
okay.
But do you want me to answer them and email them to you?
Sure. Yeah, if you have time, I know there's a lot on your plate right now. I don't definitely no urgency. Whenever is best. We can either share them right after this event in our post-program materials, or we can even share them afterwards at a future date.
It'll be afterwards. It'll
Yeah.
be afterwards.
Yeah.
But yes, I would be
Yeah.
happy to do that. And
Okay.
then I can
Right.
just send you like the document and you can, yeah, send
Okay.
the link
Yeah,
out.
yeah, we can definitely share it with our membership team, and they can send it out with our newsletters. Which, by the way, if no one has signed up for our SLASC newsletter, you can do so at our website, and I will put the link for that here.
And I love your newsletter. I subscribe now. It's great.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. I will tell our membership team. Oh, Julie has a question. You mentioned being well-rounded. Do you have any tips outside of joining associations/groups that will help both hone in on an interest but be well-rounded in LIS, like right out of grad school?
Let me think about this. You might, I always think like, what are your hobbies or your personal interests? And I know we all don't have time, and especially when there's life and homework and things that have to be done at, work and such. But I think look at your hobbies, like, and your interests, and if there's ways you can build that in, and it might be something you might think does not apply at all to LIS, but actually you can create it into a program or
Right.
create something, write a piece. It could be a blog piece for the student chapter. It could be, you
Yeah.
could turn that into something that you might not think um, necessarily ties into LIS, but it does.
Hmm.
And so that's why I always say look outside of um, even associations too.
Right.
I mean, I'm very involved with some running groups, though I haven't lately because of getting COVID, but COVID, that little thing. But I think like, and then we learn different skills that we can apply. Like running a marathon, you learn like discipline, training.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things that then you can apply to. You have all of these due dates and you can plot it out. And it's like,
Yeah.
because you learn that from the running and you know how to, you prepare an outline, you have your bullet points, you do your note cards, whatever it is, and then you go and present and you have your notes on your slide. But that's like training, and you learn that from practice even in other areas.
Right. Yeah.
So I think thinking about um, maybe all of the things that you have done or like to do, Julie, that might kind of fit in. And even with job hunting, I think that's another area, at least for me, I applied to a ton of jobs. I was like, I don't care if they tell me no. I probably have more no's than yeses, and I applied early. So I would say apply early. Don't wait till you get the degree. Like apply early and see if you can secure a job that they'll wait for you to graduate.
Mhm.
Um, which mine, they did, the law firm did. They waited and they waited for me to relocate. So
Yeah.
I
Nice.
think that, and then kind of building on all those different skills. So do your own kind of skills assessment too.
Mhm.
But I'd love to talk with you, Julie, offline. Maybe we can I don't know, strategize on other ideas.
Thank you. Kevin, I see you have your hand raised.
Hi, thanks for your talk, Michelle. Mine's not a question, it's just a bit of an observation. With respect to your talk, your ideas on cultural competencies in organizations and how far or fast or whatever. In my experience, having worked for the organization I do for over 20 years, it's a little bit of a slow evolutionary process, which in our case has kind of sped up very definitely over the last 5 years. So my observation is that it's not something that happens overnight, to quote an ad here in New Zealand, but it will happen. But it just depends on how committed the organisation is to that particular issue, and how far and how fast they want to do. We here have had both internal but certainly external, I guess pressure is the word, to move that way. So it's a combination of, those pressures plus a willingness of the organisation to recognise that we have needed to move in that direction. Here in New Zealand, the overwhelming Indigenous people, of course, are Māori. And over the last, well, quite a period of time, but for us as an organisation, possibly 10 years, there has been a real movement to include them in, especially because we're a scientific organisation, how do we relate to what we do to what their cultural issues are? How do we incorporate them in our organisation? And there's been a real push, especially as I said, in the last 5 to 10 years, to move that way, such as that we actually have a group within our organisation now, which is the Māori Impact Group, which looks at our science. How does it impact upon Māori? What do Māori want from us with respect to the science? And as a information professional, of course, that's also impacted on me because, I've had to incorporate a lot of what we're talking about and what I do, and also relating to the particular individuals in the group that has formed, and sort of change in some ways, although the basics is pretty similar, what kind of work I do for them and what sort of things they're interested in and that sort of thing. So it's been it's a very much an evolutionary process. I've discovered, there are pressures, and then there is internal thinking about it and how do we do this, and we've kind of had both of those. So that's just my observation on your point about organizations and how they relate to things like cultural competencies over a period of time.
And it's so true what you're saying, Kevin, and thank you for sharing that. I think an example was too, I had received it's a federal grant with an organization, and then they retracted it. They had awarded it to me, retracted it because two things. They had the week before, I think the executive director had resigned, and they were then going to have to find a new executive director. And then they decided they wanted to hire a DEI manager. And so and I think even externally, they were getting some pressures from the communities and trying to, like, why aren't you doing this? So like one population wanted this, or one community wanted this, the other this. And then they had kind of a person left that was really the champion behind it and pushing. And so it got squat. And right now, I just emailed them actually last week, and they said we're still evaluating, and that was 2 years ago. So I think, yeah, you're definitely right. And there are like the internal and also the external, and then of course budgets. I mean, there's so many moving pieces when we think about these aspects, and there is no straight line. Like and every organization is different. It's like a living organism that's always changing. And I think to the people internally, if there's turnover or there's that change, then that makes it even more difficult, or could be a positive depending on the direction. So thank you for
And
sharing that.
I'll
Mhm.
give you just one other example of that. We are, well, depending on the outcome of some government policies in the kind of near future, but our headquarters is in Wellington, and finally it was decided they wanted to build a new building. And one of the things that was done right at the very beginning is continued right through to a point where it's not getting built yet, as I said, for other reasons, but the local iwi, which is the tribe that is in the area where the actual building is being built, were consulted all along the way in respect to the building, in terms of its structure, how it would look, how it would include it, how it would put itself into the area where it's being built, and also issues of cultural significance, etc. So I guess in some respects that's kind of like almost a complete evolution of a process in one area, although we as an organization have got lots of other areas that we need to go further than we do. But we are, I look upon that as something of not even as a tick, but certainly in terms of where we were and where we've come to from that point of view, is something that's kind of like almost an end point of one particular part of that process. And so I guess also, while it is the evolutionary, there is some of what we're doing and some of what organizations can do is that sort of thing, where we include the local tribe of the Indigenous people in almost all of the aspects of building the building. So I mean, it's kind of,
That's wonderful.
yeah. So
I mean, yeah, and many communities do not do that. So that is actually, and that I would say is more important than by the time it gets built, right? It eventually will, but
yeah, well, one hopes it will.
hopefully, yes,
Yeah,
I hope so.
yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. I think
Yeah.
I got to turn it over to Tina. I think we're out of time.
Yes, I was just about to say, interesting
Sorry.
time. No, thank you everyone for participating, your questions, and of course, Dr. Villagran, for your time and sharing your experience and answering all of my questions and the questions of the audience. I'm just going to share a link to our post-program survey. For anyone who has the time, we would greatly appreciate hearing about your input on the event. If you have any questions, you can also direct them to myself or the SLASC main email, or then leave them in the survey and we can turn them over to Dr. Villagran as well. So thank you again,
Tina.
Professor Villagran, and thank you
And
everyone
any
for
of
joining us.
you, any of you can reach out to me. I mean, you can find me at SJC website. Tina has my email. You'll pass it on. But any of you can call me, email me. I love to chat and
you.
happy to help any students, any information professionals with whatever topics you'd like to talk about. But thank you again, Tina, and thank you to SLA.
Thank you
Thank you,
for your
Tina.
time.
Thank you, Dr. Villagran.
Joining.
Good night, or
Good
good
night,
morning, or good afternoon.
Thank
We'll
you.
cover it all.
Yes.
Bye, Tina.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.